we're sort of inundated with social media and social networks, and you can sort of see how they. So I found this quote from the book, The Clue Train Manifesto, just sort of once again it's describing just how powerful social networks have become and how it's sort of changing the way in which we sort of communicate and view the world. And then here's another chart that's a little outdated that sort of shows the size of social networks. And at the time, Facebook only had 175 million people. Now it's up to 400 according to its statistics. And then LinkedIn at the time was down at 36, and according to its site, it's up to 60 in over 200 countries. So you're definitely growing at an extremely high pace or fast pace. So here is a book that I sort of relied heavily on, at least just sort of some background knowledge, sort of looking at differing perspectives of how the internet's going to sort of change and mold our world and our relationships. So the first that they sort of brought up is this utopian perspective that sort of looks at the internet as an opportunity to sort of expand our communications and our relationships and allows us to sort of take advantage of the internet and not as a detriment. And then sort of a couple psychologists that were in the that they quoted for the book is sort of built upon this, saying that it's a way to sort of it's not going to change the way, it's not going to have a detrimental effect or necessarily a positive effect. It's just going to make it easier, if you will. And then on the other side is this dystopian perspective, where it's just going to further erode our relationships that are already starting to go down that path, which when I get to Putnam, sort of building upon that as well too, which they also cited heavily. The major, or one of the major sort of demographics that use social networking are teenagers, and so I don't know if you guys got a chance to look at the Digital Nation special that Vic had recommended, but I got a few sort of clips from that, one of which I'll show you in a minute. But the Pew Research Center had showed a study that 75% of online adults ages 18 to 24 have a social network profile, and nearly 5/6 of those have multiple ones. And back in 2007, the Pew study also showed that 55% of 12 to 17-year-olds in the U.S. were members of social networks, so even going lower to the early teens.
By the way, Chris, I don't usually interrupt people on this, but this is the second time today that I've seen statistics on either 18 to 34 or 18 to 39, and I'm personally offended that they don't look at old people.
Well, I would say that even though
I'm just kidding.
It is beyond necessarily what I'm looking at in this presentation, but I think I've heard a statistic that says that 45 to 55 or maybe even higher are like the fastest growing sort of joiner-uppers or joining up on social networks.
I'm not serious about being offended, I'm just kidding.
And then also, according to Facebook, and I thought this was a pretty startling statistic, users spend more than 6 billion minutes per day on Facebook, which is more than 100 million hours, or nearly 11.5 million years, which is a pretty insane figure if you talk about it on a daily basis. The average user, according to Facebook, spends nearly an hour on Facebook, and I guess with 400 million people, even if you took the average user as 25%, that's where those figures come to. And so here's another example from Digital Nation about some teenagers talking about how Facebook has sort of shaped their lives.
Pretty much everyone has one. It's like a section of the internet that is your own. Like, you can make it your personality exactly.
Like, everyone has a MySpace. You can find the geeks, the nerds, the popular people, just all sorts of people. Like, get on that, won't get off till my mom tells me to get off. I just stay on my face. Like, you just message your friends and leave comments and picture comments, take pictures, like pretty pictures, and put it on my face, and people comment it. And my face is a big thing, yeah, it is.
It'll tell you who's in a relationship, who's not in a relationship, when someone breaks up or when someone gets together.
There was a competition in who could have friends most
Yeah,
friends.
that was the big
That
thing
was
at
that was
first.
huge.
Yeah.
But
oh,
now-
I have 2,000. Blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. And like most of them you don't even know.
You
You
don't
have
know,
2,000.
But you have to admit, you really only know about 200 people. Like, you actually met them in person, you know stuff about them. You're only best friends with like 50 people. And having 2,000 friends, you're like, oh, she's a yeah, or he's a B.
So, just I guess that's just an example of how common it is in sort of what is taking place on social networks. So first I'll take the sort of the positive route, and have been countless reports out there that sort of point to social networking and the positives impact that it has on sort of allowing us to continue to expand our relationships and take advantage of sort of distant relationships and friends who've moved away. And I have quite a bit of research and quite a bit of sort of documentation in this report that I'll show you too. But these three quotes sort of came from a quorum that had consisted of a couple other high-profile, I guess, sort of sociologists or people with research in this area. And all of these, like I said, I mean, Dana Boyd is pretty well known. She came and spoke last semester in talking about social media as an opportunity for us to take advantage of the children and teens especially have sort of used it as a way, not necessarily to connect with new people and meet new friends, but to sort of complement and solidify their relationships that they have in the real world. And here's another sort of just, I guess, quote from her talking about it's just sort of this digital playground where people are able to come together with their friends and to socialize. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. Another aspect that the Goodwin book had said, and even Boyd had talked about too, is that social networks allow for teenagers to sort of express themselves in a way that they may not be comfortable with in the real world, or at least in the physical world. And so she had talked about just sort of it's been an opportunity for homosexual men and homosexual sort of women as well to come out in a way that they, on their terms, and when they may fear that there's going to be some social backlash from people who don't approve of their lifestyle. And then also, Vic had talked about earlier in the semester that somebody in the past had done a paper on sort of pro-Ana sites or whatever. And in I guess a prequel of sorts to the Digital Nation, there was a special that Frontline had done called Growing Up Online. And here's a clip of a girl talking about her sort of experiences and how everybody wasn't familiar with her actual lifestyle and what she, not even her parents. So I thought this was pretty interesting.
I'm 16, just turned 16 yesterday. I'm a swimmer. I've been swimming for 7 years. I play golf. I'm really fun and outgoing. And I work hard in school. And a lot of the people in my school are like, wow, she's smart.
I know what it means, like nobody else does.
It's weird because I have like this one life that's fake. That's like the happy-go-lucky, whatever. And then I have the real me. When I'm online, I'm the real person. I'm completely 100% me. Like, I'll talk about anything to these people because I know they won't judge me. Sometimes sometimes it makes me feel better because it's like, oh, there's people out here like me, like I can have a little like niche of my own, like, little comfort zone. But sometimes it makes me feel worse because I know how many people are suffering like me.
So this just goes
Sarah
into
has an eating disorder.
details about sort of her background, but just sort of exemplifies the ability of sort of the online and the social networking and sort of realms to allow people to sort of express themselves on their own terms outside of sort of feeling any physical pressures of the outside world. And then one more sort of example of this that was mentioned in both clips, and I don't know how I never heard of it before, but I don't know how familiar any of you are with Jessica Hunter, who sort of created this profile on MySpace called Autumn Meadows. And so this is sort of an example, this is from the Dateline special, or the Frontline special, excuse me, talking about her sort of ability to sort of get away from reality and what it meant to her. So.
I didn't want to be known as Jess. That was the last thing that I ever wanted, because all it did was remind me of the girl who had no friends. And I wanted to be the total opposite. I never fit the mold. I would try and try and try, and it just wasn't me. I was constantly being made fun of. People would push me into my locker. They'd constantly be calling me a goth. I felt so insecure. I felt like an alien, you know, in this all white bread town. Email address, profiles, everything. Everything was Autumn Meadows. I knew that I could not tell them because they wouldn't understand. You know, like I would lie my ass off just to keep my identity sacred.
She just withdrew. You never saw her. She wouldn't eat with us. She just disappeared into her room. I would open her door, try to get in. What are you looking at? And, screen would change, and I was concerned. What's going on? Is she talking to bad people?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on here?
I was only 14, but I looked like I was 18. I'd be in like lingerie or something. And more and more people started noticing. Like, oh, you're so beautiful. Like, I love this picture of you. It like really got big. I was on the computer all day, replying. Like, I would hit the refresh button, and there would be like 10 more comments. It was crazy. It was so crazy, but I loved it. I've heard from actual friends of mine that live in, South Jersey. They were like, somebody came up to me today, I was talking about you. And they were asking me, so, like, have you ever heard of this model, Autumn Meadows? And they're like, yeah, you mean Jess, right? And the person would be like, no, her name's Autumn. I didn't feel like myself, but I liked the fact that I didn't feel like myself. I felt like someone completely different. I felt like I was famous.
Woo! You can be a part of Digital Nation.
So that, once again, is just another sort of, I guess, real-life example of how teenagers have been using social networking as a means to sort of escape reality. I guess in a more positive way of framing that as an opportunity to sort of express themselves in ways that are more acceptable in their terms, or they feel more comfortable with than they would doing it in the physical world. And then, so this was another interesting sort of argument I found in this book too was sort of talking about sort of cybersex as a means of not necessarily completely on social networks, but I guess just sort of whether it be message boards or even just chat rooms. But I thought these were some interesting sort of pros and cons related to it. And also, I mean, some of them went along with this sort of ability to express and sort of breaking down barriers. And then there were some cons that they had mentioned as well too, just sort of that it also led to sort of negative sort of connotations in the physical world and relationships and people sort of struggling with being able to cope in a physical relationship. So this is kind of where, for the time being, the tide of my presentation is going to move to a sense of, so we've sort of looked at, here are the positives, comments that we've sort of seen in all the literature promoting social networks and what it has to offer, but is it really all that positive? And so I found this, this sort of summary of different elements of social networking and what potential negative impacts they could actually have on our society. And one of the major things, and I'll get to it explicitly in another slide, was just talking about the lack of being able to communicate nonverbal cues on social networks. And now there are, I guess, emoticons and sorts that tend to allow a greater sense of that, and also video. But there's another clip that I thought was pretty interesting that came from CBS a couple years ago, talking about not necessarily or specifically social networks, but just technology and the internet in general.
Facebook, MySpace, texting, BlackBerry, Crackberry.
They're the tools of Generation Y, 20-somethings raised with a mouse in one hand and an iPod in the other, and the talent for driving a lot of us crazy.
They don't want to have phone conversations, they want to have text conversations.
I don't think they take being at work on time seriously.
They spend too much time in front of a computer. It's a different generation, you know.
A lot of older managers view them as spoiled brats.
Author Ron Alsop calls this generation millennials. Savvy about using technology, but kind of clueless when it comes to communicating face-to-face. Their clothing is casual, flip-flops to meet the president, and their language, acronyms for everything, like BRB for Be Right Back, and LOL for Laughing Out Loud.
Some millennials will put this text messaging shorthand in formal memos and business reports. Might even put in a happy face.
As for FaceTime at the office,
they feel like as long as they get the work done, when they come in, when they leave, should be somewhat up to them.
Even they admit they're often better at reading on-screen emoticons than real-world emotions.
We always need to check our email. We always need to be on the internet. We always have to be on, instant messaging with our friends. And it's the same thing with music. Without music for us, it's like, just another boring day.
Like it or not, we may be watching evolution in action caused by prolonged exposure to technology.
It's clearly changing our lives, but it's also changing our brains.
Neuroscientist Gary Small says all that time staying connected has strengthened some brain pathways at the expense of others. Just compare an offline experience
So here's your brain on a book,
with an online one.
and here's your brain on Google.
Accounting giant Ernst & Young says by 2011, 60% of its employees will be Gen Y. So it's holding generational dynamics workshops, as well as scheduling a face-to-face meeting with each new hire to introduce concepts like meeting face-to-face.
That is our workforce. That is what we are going to build our firm on. They're the leaders of tomorrow.
It's all about flexibility and teamwork. In other words, Gen Ys could lose the stereo headphones once in a while, and the rest of us could lose the stereotypes.
It's a different world. Is that what you're getting at now?
Daniel Seberg, CBS News, New York.
All right, so I mean you can take that from
In the world of college basketball, there is nothing.
So most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. And I guess I'll put the caveat that this was written back in the turn of the century, so maybe 10 years ago. So some of the arguments, especially with the first, related to this first point, have been improved upon with social networks and allowing the use of multimedia and video chat and audio chat, whereas back 10 years ago, with slow internet speeds and maybe not those components built in, it wasn't, you weren't as capable. But his main complaint regarding that was that there are just tons of nonverbal cues that are lost through just text chat, and that people are losing the ability to respond sort of on the instantaneous level because they're sort of waiting out, whereas if you saw somebody sort of get excited in a conversation, you'd be maybe able to sort of cut them off or just sort of interject before you wait it out. And then another aspect that sort of goes hand in hand, I know in some sense Cass Sunstein sort of talked about an idea of cyber balkanization and forcing people to, or the internet and social networks sort of allowing people to sort of come together with those who they share specific viewpoints with, and sort of at the expense of coming and sort of interacting with people who are different from them or sort of diverse views. And then this last point of the single standard interaction, his argument was that in the sort of social networking world, or these sort of online arena, people interact there and only there, whereas if you were communicating with your neighbor, you could sort of see your neighbor at a picnic next door, you could run into your neighbor at Target or the grocery store, or somewhere where you're sort of forced to see that person in a setting where you may not be as comfortable, or just sort of, I guess, more spontaneous. Another interesting study I found that came out of New York University, sort of this is one sort of statistics, I know it's kind of hard to read, so I'll sum it up, but had talked about excessive internet use by teens and what impact that has had on their participating in social activities, whether it be sports or other extracurricular activities. And so they defined sort of extreme internet use as people who are using it more than 8 hours a day. And they did notice that this this percentage was relatively low. It was around 1 or 2% of the people in their study. So it wasn't a great deal, but the numbers were pretty startling into the sense that they spent almost 4 hours less per week in sports and outdoor activities than those who used the internet less than 8 hours, as well as the fact that, and this is kind of beyond the scope of the presentation, but just that their body mass index was higher just from sitting in front of the computer, so there were health risks involved with excessive internet use as well too. And so one interesting thing I found in an article sort of discussing the negatives of social networks, and so this is a sort of a spoof site that somebody set up, sort of mocking sort of Facebook and social networks in general, and sort of the idea that people are adding all these friends, and as you saw the teenagers and discussing how many friends and having 2,000 friends, and do they really know these people? There was also I guess an application of sorts that was supposed to go on Facebook, which was called Enemy Book, and the creator of that had a quote that said, "I was worried by the fact that the friend relationships mean so little online. People seem to add everybody they've ever met, but you might not want to share anything with everybody. In real life, you have close friends, acquaintances, and all manners of relationships in between." So he created a site that, or an application that would allow you to sort of differentiate between these sort of acquaintances of sorts. And then I guess one thing that I thought was pretty interesting, and I found quite a bit of text relating to, was the idea of internet addiction. And I'll show you a clip in a second here from the Digital Nation special that talks about a kid in South Korea who seems pretty excessive amounts, about around 7 or 8 hours a day on the weekdays, and then all weekend, pretty much nonstop, without sleeping. And then Dr. Gary Small, who was in that CBS Special had made a comment saying that he realized thinks it's addictive. And then this was a study that came out of China and Australia talking about how, once again, internet addiction can actually have negative impacts, not only on personal relationships, but just on subjects themselves, and that they're more likely to engage in, I guess, can't think of the word, but they're more likely to injure themselves than somebody who is not considered to be addicted to the internet.
Does that mean that they're just more accident prone, or that they inflict?
I think it's more self-inflicted. So that was the thank you for the term I was looking for.
We met 15-year-old Chung Myung-il in a city south of Seoul.
좀 심한데요.
It's pretty extreme.
하루에
I play 7 or 8 hours a day. Then on weekends, I stay up all night on the computer.
When Young-il starts a game, he doesn't know when to stop, and he just plays for hours.
Over the last year, Young-il has dropped from the top half of his class to the bottom. His mother thinks it's because of the computer.
I'm not sure, but I think he mostly uses the computer to play some type of fighting game. I wish those games didn't exist. That inability to communicate with me, his own mother, makes me so sad. I think if I can't control him right now, I may lose my son. This is an addiction. Only an addict could act this way.
So, arguably, those were not necessarily social networks, but video games. But it still sort of showed the impact in that sort of disconnect from society and the ability to communicate with, in that case, with somebody who is his a family member, his own mother. And the piece sort of went on showing an internet sort of rescue camp or whatever, and people going to like this 2-week camp trying to sort of re-socialize themselves, if you will, and sort of try to get them off the internet and wean them off, where he had said that he thought it was interesting, but he figured it wasn't personally going to help him, that he would go back to using the internet just as often as he did before. So here are a couple quotes that also come from different sort of, I guess, experts, quote unquote, or if you will, discussing internet addiction here in the U.S. and sort of recognizing it as a problem. And I thought these were kind of interesting. And then these were some quotes from individuals who had posted just to a thread asking whether they thought that social networking, Facebook specifically, was addicting. And so, I mean, here are presumably, I can't really authenticate whether they're actually telling the truth or not, but I don't really see a reason for them to lie or whatever. So it was kind of interesting to talk about them sort of admitting that they have an issue with using Facebook too much and that they get addicted and that they can't stop. And sort of the bottom one talking about her not personally having Facebook, but that her younger sister does, and sort of seeing what impact that actually has on her. So I guess this gets to the point of, is there in fact this digital divide that I sort of mentioned, in the sense that are we really seeing a negative impact in the physical world and our physical relationships, or are social networks actually just complementing and in some sense strengthening the relationships we do have in the physical world? So here are three different proponents of social networks talking about how it is an optimistic sort of look at social networking, and that it is really not amplifying or not really playing a detrimental effect. And then on the flip side, here were a couple others who talked about noticing in their sort of through their studies, and this middle one actually being like a couple counselor, so sort of through her own personal patients or clients, if you will, sort of noticing this negative impact that they have in people being less apt to communicate given their sort of addiction or obsession or just sort of reliance on social media and social networks. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then I found a study done at Michigan State where they had taken a random sample of 800 students that they got from the registrars and sort of monitored their activity on Facebook. And they found out, or through their studies, they found that social networking, the use of Facebook specifically, actually did have a positive impact, or at least the use of it wasn't to try to meet new friends, and was just the opportunity to sort of talk to people in their dorms or people that were in their classes when they were away. So it wasn't necessarily taking away from the physical relationship or time that they would be spending. It was just sort of or wasn't in substitution. It was more just sort of complementary. And here is just a chart that they had sort of created that shows that the people that they think that are the majority of the people that they had on their Facebook, and part of this probably comes from the fact that there were probably a fair amount of those who were freshmen in their study, that the majority of the people that they sort of had their account and looked at their account and they were friends with were high school friends, people that they had just sort of moved away with, and this was an opportunity for them who were at other schools to sort of continue these conversations and an opportunity to talk to them on a semi-regular basis, not an extremely regular basis, and that there was and then this was a study done by the Pew Research that had talked about, that also shows and demonstrates that some people do use it to make new friends, but for the majority of them, it is to sort of stay in touch with friends and people that they don't see very often. And then this chart on the left sort of shows that what they call, this term called super communicators, or people who communicate through multiple sort of mediums, whether it be email, text, talking on the phone, that most teens, they still do in fact use sort of traditional technology and devices to talk with their friends. So social networking wasn't necessarily eroding their relationships with people, and so I guess without them. And then so I guess my final slide. This comes, and I apologize for the poor quality. I couldn't find an electronic version, so I just scanned it myself. But so this is this is from Putnam, and it's sort of demonstrating TV, kids watching TV, and to what effect the one on the left sort of shows sort of social capital, and those who watch less TV. There's states where kids watch less TV. There's higher social capital, and then on the left, the other indicator is educational performance, and so saying high social capital with high educational performance. So I'm just querying, is it too much of an extrapolation, too great of an extrapolation at this point to think that the internet can also have this effect where kids are using the internet too often, that they're going to that social capital is going to decline, and that we could in fact see negative, whether it be causal vector or just correlate, or whether it be a correlation, whether we're going to see educational sort of negatives as well too. This is just my source list.
Questions? I think it's a really interesting problem.
looking at it more exploratory, and I mean, I'll put the caveat to that. I don't really know if, like, I would use the word problem too. I think part of the reason that that the topic became an interest to me was less that I feel that social networks don't have a positive impact on our society, but just that it seems like that's the overwhelming majority of the conversation sort of seems to lead us to believe that way. And I was kind of curious, is this in fact is this the case? I mean, are there? I mean, maybe if you were to sort of calculate it out, that it would be more positive than negative, but just to sort of bring these negatives to a light, and to what extent? I mean, I guess in some cases you sort of see the internet addiction, maybe whether that be regulating it or more so just sort of bringing these sort of camps or these sort of government subsidized sort of classes to sort of educate parents as well as students and kids who have sort of, even whether it be a admitted addiction or whether they're forced by their parents to go into this, just an opportunity to sort of come to terms that there is an issue, whether they're in denial or not. And I guess you can sort of see the other extreme in terms of being in like the public sector or the private sector, in that sort of Ernst & Young, and whether, I mean, I know a lot of people laughed at it or whatever, but I mean, I guess this is a company that feels that the next generation is sort of lacking in these sort of communication skills and sort of these more traditional social skills, that they're going to actually spend money to sort of re-educate, and in some cases maybe just educate them for the first time, this next generation to actually be able to be productive as members of their company.
Questions?
So there's like a lot of gray area here, like as far as like there's not a lot quantitatively that's available. So I guess my first question would be where are you leaning towards, and then as an extension of that, how do you plan to sort of extrapolate it? Like I'm assuming you're not planning on making like a quantitative argument based on like statistics. So
I would say that in response to your first question, I would think that there probably is a fair amount, and I've come across, I guess, a fair amount of quantitative data that sort of indicates the positives of social networking. It's on that sort of opposite spectrum, or that opposite side of the issue, that shows really what negative aspects are. I was listening to and I included a quote in there, sort of like the digital divide, claiming that there is an issue, but I was listening to this sort of podcast from a psychologist in England, sort of posing, and she admitted it herself that this is something she's noticing, but it's probably needs to go to that next level where a study needs to be conducted, and she's just sort of positing at this moment, but can't really analyze any data because there sort of is a lack or a dearth of data, sort of indicating, and even still, a lot of the literature that I came across on the negative side of social networking was more sort of editorials, and then they did include some quotes from doctors, but I mean, I guess if you want somebody, you can always get somebody who's going to sort of corroborate your point or your side of the argument.
Yeah, this is a very fascinating subject. Another thought that I had was, you may want to take a view from a social psychology standpoint. Obviously, the technology is the catalyst here, but there has been a lot of interest voiced, probably going back 60 years, in the so-called evolution of the American personality or psyche, and how that's changed from its traditional orientation, to some of the manifestations that were pretty apparent in this presentation that you put together. There was a book written, and Victor helped me with this, about 60 years ago by David Reesma, called The Lonely Crowd.
The Lonely Crowd.
It was something that you may want to look at, that was written, very famous, written in a different time and place, right after World War II, in which he saw some early stage indicators of this massive change that was going on in the psyche of people essentially, I think, was focused on the United States. But that might be an interesting thread to pursue.
Have you thought about comparing social networking addiction to cell phone addiction? Because
I'm listening.
because
I wasn't sure if that if you were
right.
continuing with that.
Because I just feel that at least for cell phone addiction, people still get to have a real like a voice conversation. In the sense you're still talking to somebody, except it's not face to face. So it's not quite the same as social networking addiction, because for social networking addiction you can fake a personality, but then when it comes to like communication through the cell phone, you still have to be yourself. It's hard to.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if anybody, I think Vic was there, but to the Tanzine Chowdhury, I don't remember how you pronounce her last name. I went to her speech a couple weeks ago, and I thought that it was a really interesting topic. I thought that, I mean, part of it was just really over my head in terms of being able to understand it. But I thought there was some interesting sort of statistical analysis in that, in terms of, that didn't necessarily include cell phone addiction or addiction in general, but just sort of taking audio samples from inside the classroom and sort of monitoring to what extent people communicate, and whether they were like sort of dominating personalities, or whether they, as they became more comfortable with one another, whether it sort of evened out in terms of people speaking. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, I was actually just curious. In what way do you personally feel this is not so much just a deterioration of social interaction, but more just kind of a shift in cultural values? I mean, obviously, when the company's concerned about their younger employees not being able to communicate face to face, I think the issue there is not so much that they can't communicate amongst people their age or people younger than them, but that they just can't communicate with their superiors who are probably going to be older than them. But 10, 20, 30 years from now, where that's not so much an issue, is it really going to matter that they have to train people in those same ways? I mean, at what point is this just kind of a hiccup, just natural kind of evolution of just values and people's attitudes?
I mean, I guess that is definitely an interesting way to look at it, in the sense that now just sort of people, I mean, I don't remember when my family got our first computer, but I was probably like 8 or 9. Now it seems like every kid is sort of trained on having a computer. And so now, whether, like you said, whether we're going to value face-to-face communication, especially sort of in a more global world, whether, communication via social network, or just via teleconference calls, video conference calls, which I guess has some face-to-face component, whether those are going to be replaced as people become more reliant and at least sort of more comfortable using technology, or whether there are going to be, I saw, and I took it out because I thought it was a little beyond the scope. I was going to sort of include it in the positives of social networking, but sort of doctors using social networking to sort of treat patients and and there was talking about when H1N1 came out, I think it was, just sort of tweeting sort of updates regarding that. So I think that you're sort of seeing professions that are traditionally thought to be more heavy in the face-to-face communication, and whether if they're adopting sort of the new technology and sort of with open arms of sorts, whether it is just a hiccup, and whether 20 years from now that is going to be something that isn't going to be as big of a deal as people are sort of making it out to be at the moment.
Questions? As you know, excuse me, I was very upset by that production of Digital Nation, because it really brought to light so many negative consequences of networking technology, and you're bringing out a lot of it too. You are taking an overview approach, and there is the issue of policy that you want to address. But besides that, do you, Sherry Turkle,
Yeah, I saw she was in that.
she was in your list of references, did some work on The Second Self was her first book, where she was really talking about, at that time, computer programmers, and how they tended to be sort of inward-looking nerds in a way. They were incapable of genuine social interaction, and their interaction with the computer began to substitute for that personal interaction. Now, you can look at that from this point of view, from the point of view of the individual and their inability to interact with other individuals. You can also, excuse me, look at it from a social, more, social group kind of thing, where I've observed that people tend to be using, joining clubs less. The whole idea of bowling alone, they don't join the bowling leagues, they don't join. I've noticed this even to the extent of professional societies. It used to be that when you entered a profession, like if you were doing what you guys are all doing and getting your degrees and becoming professionals, instead of joining LinkedIn, you would join a professional society that represented your particular interests. And this was a way of networking with other people, of interacting by becoming an officer in the organization, a way of getting jobs. It was a whole way of social networking. That was my generation's social networking. The question I would have is the extent to which the new social networking is a positive replacement for that, or whether it is, as you seem to be pointing out, just a set of problems with that. It's very difficult for me to get a handle on this, and of course I come from a generation prior to the online networking, where personal interactions were not only important, but it was all you had. It was the only way you interacted with people. So I'm curious about that. I just don't know where to take that. I wonder what your take on it is, having looked at all these sources.
Well, I thought one of the, and I don't remember if it was in the period where the audio was off, or even that blip where I was trying to fix it, but I remember seeing just even a sentence or two on that first YouTube clip I showed that talked about organizations, professions, or sort of corporations sort of embracing LinkedIn of sorts, and sort of using that as a tool for both recruitment as well as just sort of identifying potential applicants. And I mean, I guess that's more of a networking than, I've never signed up for careers.com or Monster, or one of those, where I think that's more of just putting your resume out there and somebody can look over it, and it doesn't really have that networking component as much. But it definitely seems like these social networking, especially in like the job standpoint, does have a positive, just because it allows for, I guess maybe a cheaper way to sort of find candidates. But I would also, just through research as well as my, I guess, own personal experiences, it also seems like that positive feedback you can get, or sort of recommendation you can get from somebody you know, definitely sort of goes a long way as well too, if not greater than finding me. Sort of, do you have the resume, but also do you have somebody? Did you work with somebody who can pass that sort of?
What what's troubling me, I think what you know, it's hard to pinpoint what was bothering me so much about this, but I think that the thing that bothered me the most was the indication, it wasn't really, I don't think it was necessarily proven, but the indication that skills are lost, that by using these, I was always under the impression, for example, in terms of literacy skills, that young people who are constantly sending out tweets and putting comments on Facebook and doing email. I noticed in your list, email was at the end of the list, one list. And I always thought that that was improving literacy because the more you write, the better writer you become. The evidence seemed to indicate the opposite, that people are incapable of stringing more than 2 paragraphs together. They're losing the ability to write a narrative of any length. And, you know, in the old days, we used to write long letters, and the letters were actually multiple pages, you know, multiple paragraphs. People don't do that anymore. This is what was bothering me. And the other thing, of course, is this indication that people are losing social skills by doing all this networking. Now, I just don't know where to go with that because I don't think there's that much evidence. I would have thought, for example, that Facebook would increase, in fact, Chuck Severance was telling me that he thought that what young people were using Facebook for is to increase their personal interactions with individuals. You know, like hi, how are you doing? Are you going to be around this evening? Would you like to go to a movie? You know, would you like to do something where you actually are using it to increase personal contact? But this seems to indicate quite the opposite.
Well, I was just to respond to, you know, the change that occurred with human actions. I mean, this is, it goes back to like Plato and the Phaedrus when he's talking about, you know, the fact that you have speeches now that can come out on the papyrus and written word. Nobody's going to, you know, memorize things anymore, and discourse is going to fall apart. And I mean, there are changes. There are, you know, ways that we adapt, but I mean, it's always been a problem like this.
I think that's a good point, but I think there is still a point where we want to say qualitatively, are there some things worth preserving that are being lost? You know, and it's a very good point. When I heard you say the Phaedrus, I was like, wow, that's, you know, perked up. It's clever and it's true, and I mean, it does go all the way back to that. But you know, is there something that's actually preserved that should be preserved that is being lost? And we shouldn't just throw up our hands and say, well, things change. You know.
Well, and I think too that just to interject before that even like Dana Boyd had talked about sort of social networking is solidifying in a sense these sort of weak ties, which I guess sort of goes to what Chuck had talked about too, or at least and that seems like that sort of terminology or that phrase of like weak ties or whatever sort of popped up a lot through the research I've done, and that it is that we still have these group of friends that we hang out with on a regular basis in person, but we sort of use social networking, and I guess in some sense, whether it be LinkedIn or whether it even be Facebook, to sort of keep in touch with people who we don't see on a regular basis, just in case there can be some benefit that we can derive from it outside. I mean, whether it be sort of, oh, I'm moving to New York, I'm coming to New York in a week, do you know anybody that I can get in touch with or something like that? Something just so you have that contact or that connection. And it's sort of using, hey, how are you doing? Or happy birthday or kind of thing as a simple way of just staying in touch or just sort of showing that you're sort of paying attention as opposed to the people that you sort of associate with in person on a regular basis, whether it be daily or...
Well, in the interest, excuse me, in the interest of being an academic, it would be incumbent upon you to find evidence for your position. And, I mean, I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that you aren't. I think focus this presentation for your paper on the policy issues. You know, are we going to try to prevent students in grade school from using Facebook? Are we? I mean, they were talking about that in those clips. I like the way you used the clips, but they were actually talking about how can we, you know, keep people from using it, from abusing the technologies. Essentially, even that Korean kid, you have very serious issues there about policy that you could get into. But I just find this an incredibly rich area of questioning, you know, what we're all about, because we're making certain assumptions, I think, that may not actually be valid. And maybe they would, I don't know. I tend, you know, again, I'm older and you know, I'm on Facebook and I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 friends on Facebook. And most of what I've observed is that very few people use Facebook creatively. That is, you know, put interesting things on Facebook. Most of it is absolutely boring dribble. Now that may.
Have you figured out the hide feature?
Yeah, I use that. That may in fact be a comment on you know, my friends on Facebook. But I, you know, and I tend to see the use of email as an adjunct to, you know, mostly for setting up personal meetings and arranging things and supplementing personal interaction. Because most of the people I email with are people that I have a personal relationship, you know, direct face-to-face relationship with. So I'm just not sure. I'm not sure where that's going. Where, you know, that girl said she had 2,000 friends. You know, what is that? Where's that going?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably have 200 friends on Facebook, and I probably could delete half of those.
Well, I know. I'd like other people's comments. And all of you probably use Facebook.
I think with regard to your comment that people become less narrative, I think that less narrative. I think these days it's easier to just share things through photos or videos. People probably use these other mediums to express, their thoughts or their a message to their friends.
Well, Chris's presentation is a good example of that. I like that.
Right. So I feel that people probably become less dependent on expressing their message and their thought through words, because you have these other mediums. And I think also culturally, people are becoming less patient. Like, we don't really have the patience to sit down to write paragraphs and paragraphs, and if it takes so much shorter time to, you know, to just take a snapshot of something or to make a 3-minute video, and of course, as we say, like, you know, a picture sums up 1,000 words. So, you know, when it's so much quicker and easier to just sort of to express something, people become less dependent on communicating through words.
Well, if that's true.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think the patience issue, and I think also sort of seeing the trends that Putnam sort of demonstrated. I mean, obviously the text of that book is a huge book or whatever, so I was trying to find, I sort of focused on the chapter that he sort of devoted to social networking, at least technology and the internet. And I think you can even see, like I mentioned in the presentation, that there are, I mean, when the book was written, most of the social networks didn't allow for these more sort of posting multimedia and video, chat, and audio. And now you're seeing 10 years later that the book's kind of outdated in many respects. With regard to that, it's just that now you can post a video on your friend's wall of you going to a party or some concert or whatever, and it shows what you did, and that could be extremely sufficient or whatever than having to talk about it. But.
Yeah, I don't know how helpful the inquiry is being to, you know, the question of policy. which is, I don't know, very comprehensive and deals with this multifaceted beast that deals with all sorts of arguments and different perspectives. And if people aren't able to pay attention to all of these different things, to, you know, read through the paragraphs and paragraphs of things, they're not going to be able to sort of see or appreciate the larger picture, or even, you know, sort of know what's going on. I mean, that's not really sort of how policy can affect, you know, social networking, but is it possible that, you know, this social networking and these other things that you're doing, or whatever, you know, it's not limited just to Facebook and whatnot, is going to affect the sort of, I don't know, watering down or not caring about policy?
I mean, I guess my, that's something to take into consideration. I guess the one thing that I would think off the top of my head would be maybe it would be more piecemeal policy or whatever, as opposed to trying to sort of come up with something that is more expansive and that's going to cover everything. But I do think that's an interesting sort of way of looking at it is, I mean, if we're putting together, just in the Korean example, putting together these sort of boot camps or sort of internet addiction camps, I mean, if a kid can't even sit through the first 10 minutes without getting distracted, then how is he expecting to sit through the remaining day and the 2 weeks or however long the program runs or whatever? So, I mean, whether that is specific to an internet addiction camp or whether it would be, I mean, just class in general, and I mean, maybe that is sort of demonstrating I mean, I guess SI specifically, just sort of seeing different ways of making education more, I guess, rich and more fun, if you will, promoting these sort of interactive ways, whether that is trying to sort of counter the thought that people are losing their patience and are sort of showing a decrease in their attention span, to sort of trying to come up with methods to counter that.
I guess to me, I really see the gaming thing as being a little bit more separate than the social thing, so I'm having difficulty with that. But I've been taking another class called Cognition and Environment in the psych class, and it's been talking a lot about how when you learn, it's really dependent on the pace that you can, you know, intake information, and how text really facilitates that, whereas a lot of things that we do online and with television, it doesn't facilitate that because it just gives you at one speed. All the information is chunked in one way. So for me, the interesting part policy-wise would be looking specifically at the education sphere as to whether they're going to keep social things like Facebook and stuff out of the educational sphere, because I think that's where it's shown to have a lot more clear impact.
And I think that was there was another clip that was on the CBS that was sort of with, I think, Dr. Small, whatever, that was demonstrating that there was the one thing he talked about, your brain on Google, and sort of showing how if you're just reading a book, it looks like the brain activity is pretty minimal, right. And then showing it on Google, and he made the comment, well, that at first glance you would think that this is a good thing or whatever, you're sort of interacting with the text is really stimulating. And he wasn't necessarily saying that it was a bad thing, but that it was something to keep in mind, that maybe it is just an information overload of sorts.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what the class is talking about, how it requires, a lot of the stuff that we see online is requiring more of an instinctual, intuitive kind of, it takes our attention, it's very fascinating, it's absorbing, but it doesn't allow any reflective time, so like when you're reading, you can kind of reflect and take time out for a second, think about other things, and it's a little less stressful on you.
You had a comment, Bobby, or?
I guess I was going to come back to the point that Victor said about things not being interesting on Facebook, like kind of roll with it. And we talked about it a bit before, but like, you know, when Johan Benkoy talks in the Wealth Network about all this freed up creativity that frictionless markets allow for. So like everyone is an author, everyone's a creator. It's also this kind of point that a lot of people are just producing crap. And it's stuff that never would have been produced, and we wouldn't have had to endure it. So for every like good thing that's produced, there's a ton of stuff that we just don't really care to see. And I'm not really sure it's, you know.
Sorry. I was saying, it's kind of like a lot of stuff that it's like cinema, art.
I think it's that. I would say that's like the marketplace of ideas of sorts too.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what, I guess that's where I was going. It's not that I disagree with you, believe me.
No. More than one.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, as I said though, what troubled me most was the negative effects of these sorts of things if they really are there, because my assumption was that all these technologies simply added to a person's ability to take in information, improved your cognition, improved your ability to read and write, improved your ability to communicate and, exchange ideas and that sort of thing. And then these things come out suggesting that, in fact, they could have a very deleterious effect.
Well, I thought there was that one.
I mean, I do think gaming is separate.
Yeah.
But, some of these games can have negative effects. But even there, the evidence was that kids that play these games are developing better spatial skills and cognitive skills and that sort of thing. At least initially, that was the concept. Now they're beginning to question it.
Well, I thought it was interesting from I think it was from the Digital Nation, early on in the piece where they talked about people thinking that their multitasking skills were, that they're improving, and they're saying like that they're terrible, that they're awful at all aspects of it.
Yeah.
And I don't remember if it was you or was somebody else that was telling the class earlier that they were trying to, because I just remember, I mean, I had sort of grew up around video games, had systems on my parents bought, my brother and I growing up, but we also, when we got a computer, they tried to introduce sort of typing games, or these games that would have more of an educational value. And I don't know if you were saying at the beginning of the course that you were trying to come up with a computer game or some idea.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was you or not, but I mean, it definitely seems like, although I guess I don't know if it was necessarily called a game, but there was I didn't touch on it in the presentation, but in the Digital Nation, just sort of the whole part about Second Life, and I think that's definitely kind of an interesting thing because it sort of allows for this avatar that in many respects kind of can resemble a real person, but he also talked about sort of in terms of expressing people, maybe somebody with a physical disability who's confined to a wheelchair can sort of create an avatar where they can go around walking in this second sort of virtual world.
Oh, actually, the same thing you illustrate here with that girl.
Yeah.
Creating that false identity on Facebook. It's the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
She's creating
This is a New Yorker comic, like on the internet, no one knows you're a dog.
Yeah. So I think the thing you're talking about people focusing on creating like educational tools with based on the idea of interactivity and stuff is the Carnegie Mellon's got a whole line of OER resources that are coming out actually that they're heavily funded, and I haven't used any of them yet, but they're just released in beta for a bunch of them.
Any other questions or comments for Chris? Okay, thank you. I think you're onto something, whether you can get down to a manageable size or another.
I mean, that piece I thought was